The BBC has yet another report about children racking up debt for their parents because they were playing video games and didn't realise these video games were designed to psychologically manipulate them into spending more money. The lead story on this one is a lad with learning difficulties who managed to spend an obscene amount of money playing an iPad game called Hidden Artifacts, managing to spend over the course of a few months over £3,000 on it. £3,160 to be more precise. £3,160, 58 new pence to be more precise. If you weren't convinced of the shittiness of this situation, then I think the 58p's really gonna seal it for you. This story comes hot off the heels of a previous BBC article about a bunch of kids cleaning their parents' bank account out because they were playing FIFA. And before we go any further, there are always people who chime in with, well, isn't it the parents' responsibility? Yes, it is. But at the same time, this is a responsibility a parent shouldn't have. A parent shouldn't have to think about protecting their wallet from the video game they bought for their child. And while you or I may be knee-deep in the video game industry, we know what it's like, we know what's in many of these video games, the idea of some harmless game for kids having the ability to clean out a bank account is such an abstract concept, I'm not surprised many parents don't think about it. They know by now to think and worry about graphic content, but not psychologically manipulative, addiction-fueled microtransaction content. If a parent buys a video game with guns and screaming demons on the cover, then yeah, they shouldn't be too surprised if the video game winds up too violent for their child. If a parent buys a football game based on FIFA, which is supposedly for kids 3 and up, and they don't know exactly how bad the gambling mechanics in video games have got these days, then sorry, I retain quite a bit of sympathy for that parent. Because as used to it as we've gotten, the idea of these perpetual randomized purchases is so fucking stupid. Of course the average customer hasn't thought about it. Why would they stop to consider that the football game for their kids has gambling in it, for God's sake? And while these stories unfortunately have come at the quite literal cost of families, thank God they're getting out there so at last people can be educated on a wider scale. In a manner similar to the video we published called The Addictive Cost of Predatory Video Game Monetization, the BBC has a number of testimonials from people who have been affected by recurrent user spending in video games. While we spoke to vulnerable adults with shopping addictions and problem gambling issues, the BBC article provides testimonials from parents whose kids accidentally cost them a fuck ton of money because of these games. So here's the lead story from the article. My son spent £3,160 in one game. I have a 22-year-old disabled son who has cerebral palsy, complex epilepsy, autism, learning difficulties, and the approximate cognitive ability of a 7-year-old child. He is unable to do any bilateral activities, so relies heavily on his iPad and PlayStation for entertainment and educational activities. He has recently been playing a game on his iPad called Hidden Artifacts, which involves finding various items and matching them to the description. He has been charged £3,160.58 between 18th of February and 30th of May 2019, clearing out his entire savings. I contacted iTunes, who are extremely helpful but were unable to refund the amount, and suggested I contact Blastworks Limited, the app developer and game provider. I have phoned and emailed several times but have had no response. It is extremely distressing that vulnerable people such as my son become victims of what is thought to be an educational game. I have tried tirelessly to recoup his life savings but constantly come up against a brick wall. I won't read out all of the stories in the article, they all pretty much hit the same points, but here's one titled, "He was completely inconsolable. I installed Mini Golf King on my phone for my son who is 5. He knows he's not allowed to spend money in games, yet this game successfully tricked him into spending £300 on in-app purchases. Fortunately, my card issuer blocked some of the transactions, but a purchase for £75 went through, along with a few smaller ones. When my son realised that he'd spent real money, he was completely inconsolable, saying he was so sorry for being naughty and he thought they were pretend coins. My refund request via Google Play was automatically rejected. I explained that my son is autistic and his disability makes him vulnerable. He doesn't really understand the concept of being manipulated, and he wouldn't necessarily understand why people who make games want money. Google said I should contact Mini Golf King, which said it did not generally refund in-app purchases once the purchased items had been used. It offered to delete the account and submit a refund case to the store from which the purchases had been made, but said this would be non-reversible. I have heard nothing since. People will say, well, you should be supervising him. I was in the room, but the game is a children's game rated Peggy 3, suitable for players aged 3 and above. I would allow him to watch a U-rated film, and I assumed Peggy 3 games were safe to play with casual supervision. Yeah, you would. Most parents would. Our son spent £700 on Clash of Clans. This happened to us a few years ago when we were very new to all this. We are technically savvy but didn't think to put a password on, and my son, who was 12, ended up spending around £700. It was on his own phone, and he managed to download Clash of Clans through a Google Play account, enter his own children's bank card details, and buy lots of in-game items. We didn't realise until we checked his bank statement and it was virtually empty. He did not realise the connection, that it was real money leaving his bank account. We never got our money back apart from a token amount as a gesture of goodwill. There are lots of other stories here as well. My boy spent almost £1,000 on Fortnite. Our daughter's free trial for an app cost £93. Basketball game cost our family £2,000. Many of these games are found on mobile phones, the mobile market being where the mainstream AAA video game industry has been getting a lot of its monetization ideas. Phones have become ubiquitous. They're basically an essential part of modern life these days. People around my age balk at the idea of kids having phones. I know I do, but I think that's largely because I am getting part of the older generation and things have changed, things have moved on. Everyone has a phone, and this unfettered access that video game companies have to not just children but anyone who can be psychologically manipulated, anyone in a vulnerable position, is pretty bloody insidious, and it's something that video game companies have been exploiting for years now. Not just on phones, increasingly on PC and console as well. This constant 24/7 online access that these video game publishers want gives them all of the time and all of the access they need to dig their little claws inside people's brains. The mobile market has been perfecting this, and they know what they're doing. They boast about it in little speeches, little talks that they give to each other. We revealed one such talk on that predatory monetization video we did. This recurrent user spending that the video game industry loves so much is wholly predatory, completely exploitative. And there are still people in other areas of games media that tell me that I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. They've been dismissing my arguments for years. But more and more we're seeing that all of that dismissal is a little more than propaganda that helps companies get away with what they're doing because they expect people to not take it seriously. They expect problem gamblers and shopping addicts to be laughed at and derided and ignored. And they use that ignorance to portray such people as whales, high spenders, who just love their video game purchases so gosh dang much. They expect 100% of the responsibility to be on the customer, regardless of the context, regardless of that individual user's vulnerabilities and circumstances. I am still receiving testimonials from people. I've got enough for maybe 2 more videos, maybe 3, from vulnerable people who are cognizant of their own responsibility in all this, and as a result have had to stop playing a bunch of video games, because if they do get into a game with stuff like loot boxes in them, it may cause a relapse in their gambling addiction, and that shouldn't be the fucking case with video games, with escapist entertainment. I look at what's gone into some of these video games now, just how unchecked the exploitation in them is, and it makes me so genuinely fucking furious. Men like Andrew House who come out to defend their gambling mechanics, what EA calls their surprise mechanics. Wankers like Bobby Kotick over at Activision Blizzard, just any of these executives who perpetuate and defend these sinister little microtransactions in their video games. They should all be completely ashamed of themselves, but they're not. They don't care. They're just doing their jobs. Well, their jobs hurt people. They hurt people. Straight up. Andrew House, your job is to hurt people for money. That's what it's become. That's what you've become. As I've said many times before, I'm not laser focused on how this affects children per se. Certainly when I've talked to people affected by microtransactions, I've talked to adults with various issues. Many of those issues reflecting my own circumstances, which makes this a bit of a personal sting. But I will reiterate what I said in response to the last BBC article about this. These games should not be rated Peggy 3. They should not be rated for kids aged 3 and up. EA's response when it's called out on on kids overspending in FIFA is to throw out little guidelines, little spending caution notes for parents. And if you've got to do that, if you've got to warn parents about how to protect their children from your video game simply, literally isn't suitable for children. Is it? Your little surprise mechanics work in exactly the same way as gambling. They use the same psychological tools as gambling. They should be expected to adhere to the same guidelines and protections. And that would include not rating your parasitic garbage as suitable for kids aged 3 and up. So far, Peggy and the ESRB have not taken these concerns seriously whatsoever, which long term, as I've argued many times in the past, again for years, may very well fuck the industry up later on when someone else decides they're gonna step in and do the ESRB and Peggy's job for them. We've already seen a lot of legislative interest in the US and various places in Europe. We've seen politicians start asking questions about the effects of loot boxes. Your old pal Jim Sterling, the Cassandra of video games, said it was all coming. We're here, we're seeing a lot of chickens come home to roost, and whether or not the game industry finds a way to wriggle itself out of this, at least we're finally seeing some of these companies have to answer for themselves, have to straight out justify what they're doing, and they're embarrassing themselves in the process, like we saw when EA tried to pass off surprise mechanics as a thing. Whenever these companies are asked outright to justify their business practices, they humiliate themselves because they can't. They cannot really justify them. And since these companies feel absolutely no shame, at the very least, I'll take their fucking embarrassment. Because that's what this period of video games is. That's what this generation and the tail end of the last generation has been for video games. A fucking embarrassment.